Welcome to week 2 of English 2133. I am going to be going through some items from A Raisin in the Sun. We'll be discussing narration and point of view. And we'll talk a little bit about literary analysis as you prepare for your rough draft paper. So let's go ahead and get started. You are going to be completing, as per usual, an in-class discussion summary. And I'll kind of propose some questions here as we go. And you can choose some questions to respond to. I'd like for you to respond to at least 4 questions. And so as you see a question on the screen, feel free to write it down, reflect on that, kind of look up some evidence from the text, and write briefly on that to fulfill that requirement. So let's talk a little bit about A Raisin in the Sun. And just as a refresher here, we talked last week about Southside Chicago, again, as sort of the black capital of the U.S., is what it's kind of termed as now, or was back in the 1950s. And The Raisin in the Sun was written in 1959. As of 1950, as a recap, black unemployment was 3 times what it was for whites. And housing was very substandard. Blacks typically did not own property. It was very difficult to own property, so they would rent, and the prices were often driven up very high, much higher even than white neighborhoods. So it was very, very difficult for African Americans in Southside Chicago to find decent places to live. So when we're talking about, for the younger family, they have, rats in their house. They have worn down furniture, 1 window, very little sunlight. This is all very typical for black families. Also, those who did try to move to white neighborhoods, there was often frequent arson on those black residents. So there was an element of fear there as well if they tried to kind of move out or assimilate a little bit into other neighborhoods. And I had mentioned as well that Lorraine Hansberry, her father, Carl, had done this. They had moved to a white neighborhood, and the white neighborhood did not want them to live there. And so he sued and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. He eventually won, but again, he died soon after. And Lorraine always sort of felt like her father was very disillusioned after all of that toil and struggle, at how difficult it was and how difficult it would be for African Americans to really see progress in that area. And so that was much of perhaps what inspired her to write this play. So let's talk a little bit about what you've read. So at this point, you've already read A Raisin in the Sun, and so you should be able to kind of answer some of these questions and think carefully and critically about some of these things. So first, I want to ask, what forces deter, modify, or block each dream? So, and I'd like us to look at both internal and external. Okay, so when we're thinking about external forces, we're thinking about things sort of outside of of a body, of a person. So they could be it could be forces within the family, even it could be relationships, or it could be things kind of coming from outside of the family. So for example, we could talk about racism as a big one. Again, this is sort of exemplified in Mr. Lindner. He comes and he says, black people are happier in their own communities, and we think that they should stay there. Again, this kind of perspective of sort of burying my head in the sand and just, we'll each live in our own communities. So we have this racism as a force, perhaps. We've got a corrupt system that makes housing very difficult. Decent housing difficult for black people. We've got a class system that makes it hard for people of color to find economic opportunities, right? Which is something that blocks Walter's dream. There are financial limitations, which makes it difficult for example, for Benitha to have tuition to become a doctor, or for Walter to begin his dream of owning a liquor store or being any kind of store owner. And then we've got Mama's dream of owning property. So there's many different dreams in this story, but there's also forces that are working against them. So think too about what internal conflicts we might see. There's some differing views within the family, right? There's differing worldviews. Some, like Ruth, just want to keep their heads down. They just want to get by. There's some uncertainty. There's bickering sort of between siblings, between Walter and Beneatha. And even within themselves, this, a wavering maybe ability, belief in an ability to achieve a goal. Is it even possible? Can I even really do that? This self-doubt that begins to kind of set in after there's been so much disappointment for years and years and years. So I'll let you kind of look at some of these questions here. The question, what does Walter want to invest in? Who is his proposed business partner? These are simple elements of the plot. He, of course, is wanting to invest in a liquor store, which we've discussed. And that kind of opens up this other door, sort of this shady relationship with his business partner. So you may want to think about that, discuss that. What activities has Beneatha been involved in? Okay, shifting gears to Beneatha. We didn't really get to meet her when we read our little excerpt of the play last week, but Beneatha is an important character in this play. She is sort of a strong woman figure. We might characterize her, some people may see her as a positive character, some may see her as a negative character, but just, depending on how you see her, we could probably characterize her as, independent. She might be a little flighty, right? One of the questions is, what activities has she been involved in? Well, she's tried a lot of different things, kind of moved around to a lot of different things. So look those up. I think that may be a question on your quiz. She likes to express herself, right? She talks about this. I want to express myself. She decides to sort of wear her hair naturally. And so, we kind of have this gesture with Beneatha. This is the late 1950s. We're heading into the 60s, right? And so we could almost kind of see her as sort of gesturing toward this new era of womanhood. We're kind of moving towards this era of women's liberation. She could be sort of an early, like, hippie, or at least dabbling with that idea. But very, very different if you compare Beneatha's worldviews to Ruth, for example. And there's really not much age difference between the two, but they really seem to kind of exemplify different generations of women. And so that's an interesting kind of character comparison that we could make there. But Beneatha has aspirations, right? She's interested in becoming a doctor. And we clearly can see that this is not something that most women maybe would aspire to, especially a person of color. And when Walter hears about this, he does not react favorably, right? He suggests that she needs to go and become a nurse, like a woman should. And so we have maybe a suggestion of a little bit of sexism as well. What women should and should not be able to do, what kind of roles they should be able to take. And then, Beneatha and Walter, there's some conflict there between the two of them. She challenges Walter, and she kind of suggests that he might be an assimilationist, as we read on in the story. And Mr. Lindner offers this money for the Younger family to not move into this neighborhood. He's tempted to kind of assimilate, keep his head down, just do what people have always done, not try to buck the system. And Beneatha kind of challenges him and says, you're being an assimilationist. And of course, this is sort of a bit of a rubbing off of Asagai's character, which we'll talk about. But she suggests that an assimilation is, quote, someone who is willing to give up his own culture and submerge himself completely in the dominant, and in this case, oppressive culture. So that is what she is accusing Walter of doing. So really their worldviews are quite at odds with each other. So you might consider how that changes, or if it changes toward the end of the play. Do one or the other, do their worldviews at one point change or align? So something to think about. The plant here for Mama is an important symbol. You may have seen this continually referred to. And so it's this, this sweet little plant, and it requires sunlight. Of course, we know there's only one window in the Younger's home. And so this plant, sits in the window, and it gets its nurturing, and Mama really takes care of it. And she's very, very sweet, very mothering with this plant. And although there's not much sunlight available, she gives it what she has, right? And so this plant is very much like perhaps the youngers themselves. So think about that plant metaphor. You may look up some examples of that. That would be a great thing to kind of dig into a little bit more and make some connections there to the text. So think on that. Ruth's situation, I won't spend too much time on that, but that's an interesting moment of the plot as well. Moving on, when we're thinking about dreams, right? We've talked about dreams. Mama has big dreams. She wants to live in a home. She wants to own property. And my last question here is, why is property ownership so important to Mama? This is something I want us to really think critically about because it's not just, oh, I have a dream of owning a house. Like you or I maybe might say, I want to buy a new house one day. I want to have room for my family. It's more than that to Mama. It's more than that to the younger family. So think about why that might be exactly. I would love for you to kind of I don't want to give you answers or lead your thinking on that. So I want you to think about that carefully. Why property is so important to Mama and to as an African American mother, why that would be so important. And are those dreams enough for everyone? At the end of the play, do everyone's dreams come true or not? And which dreams come true? Are they? Is it a good thing that those dreams come true? Is it a bad thing? Think about how the plot is functioning here in this play. How does it end? Does it end on a good note or a bad note? And what might some of those implications be? Keep thinking on that as you're preparing for your paper. I'm kind of just giving you a lot of different sort of ideas that you might want to explore further in a paper. Big Walter, I won't spend any time on him. Of course, that was Mama's husband who died, right? And the check, you'll see one of those prompts there. The check is his insurance money. Right? The insurance money comes and it's $10,000, which is an astronomical amount of money back then. You might, do a quick Google and see what is $10,000 in 1959. What does that equate to now? I'm sure it's probably over $100,000. So it's quite a lot of money. And who does Mama tell first? So look that up. That might be a question on your quiz. And then I want to just talk for a moment about Asagai's character, right? Identity is a very key theme here in this play, and these characters are kind of trying to work through, what is my identity exactly? This is something we mentioned last week. As an African American, who am I? Am I African? Am I American? Am I both? How does that work? And so we're kind of working these things out, and so we've got these very different characters kind of held up against each other. And it's very clear that that's what's being done because both of them are trying to court Beneatha. So they're sort of on equal footing in terms of they are both suitors, right? But they are night and day different. This is what we often call a foil. And you may have heard of this term already, a literary foil. Foil like the tin foil you use in your kitchen. So F-O-I-L. A foil is two characters that are completely different in every way. And we are meant to see the contrast between them and analyze that. And so we've got Asagai on the left, let's say, and he is Nigerian, very proud to be African. And then we have George Murchison, right? And he is very selfish. He's very assimilated. He's from a wealthy family in New York, and he's very much assimilated into white culture. Asagai very much not so. Okay, and when Mama meets Asagai, she says, quote, "I don't think I never met no African before," which is a very telling statement, very interesting, right? That an African American woman would say that. Maybe even a daughter or a granddaughter of a slave would say, "I never met no African before." What does that say, do you think, about holding on to your roots? Do you think that is a comment of the play on it? It could be, could not be. I'm interested in your opinion. What does that say about an African American's affiliation with their ancestry? Should they know Africans and be familiar with African culture? Or is that something that, no, they're American now and, They should be, more in touch with American culture. So I'm interested to hear kind of your processing on that as to identity. But we have, again, these very two different characters, and then we've got Mama, and I think we're supposed to kind of wrestle with this idea. So I would love to hear some of your thoughts on that. But one thing I would tell you to think about is which character does the play, should I say, prompt us to like? Okay, this is something very important to think about as you are reading not only this play, but anything else you read in literature, anything else you read, full stop, period, is think about what the narrator, the author, is leading you to feel. Okay, this is important. Literature is often not neutral, and we like to think that it is. It's very objective, but actually, it was written by someone, and oftentimes that person may have a point of view or an agenda. So think about it. Which character between Assegai and George, which character do we like? Which character don't we like? What could that mean about the way the text wants us to feel or react to these characters? What could that mean? Those are the kinds of questions that I want you exploring in your final paper. So keep thinking on that. Keep thinking on that, okay? Here's a few additional questions, a little bit more plot related. We discussed George Murchison. Describe him. What is he like? Quote him from the text. Who is Mr. Lindner? We've talked about him. What does he want? What happens ultimately to the money? Does it get used for what it's supposed to, or does it get squandered? So think about that. You should know some of the answers to some of these plot questions. Walter has a breakdown. Beneatha calls him a toothless rat, right? How does Lena respond to this outburst? Does she respond condemning Walter, or does she respond in love? So look that up, refresh yourself on that. And then finally, the last moments of the play, right? When Walter is given this decision, what is he going to do? What happens in Walter at the end of the play? And let me ask you this question. If it weren't for Mama, would Walter have made that same decision at the end of the play? Something to think about. You can chew on that one. You may say yes. He was going to eventually make the right decision. He was a good guy deep down. He just needed an opportunity. Or you might say, you know what? Without Mama, he would not have made that decision. So think about those kinds of things. I'm interested in your opinion on that. And then finally, what does Mama take with her when they finally leave the house? Coming back to that plant, right? Mama takes that plant with them. And what does that mean? What does that mean that the plant is so important? She takes it on to the next house. And how does that set up what will happen in the future? So these are kind of some discussion questions I want to leave you with, some thoughts. And I would like for you to kind of chew on something that's interesting to you. There might be other things that we didn't mention here that you want to discuss in your paper, and we'll talk about the paper at the end of our discussion here today. But let's move on to a couple of things real quickly. This isn't going to be a super long video for you to watch, but just want to get through a couple of things. I'd like to talk about narration and point of view. And we mentioned last week how in a drama there is no narrator, right? But everything we're moving on to be reading after this point, after Raisin and Sun, moving into week 2, will have a narrator and a point of view. So let's kind of frame our thinking around that. So a couple of questions you want to ask is, what is the voice of the narrator? What is the voice of the narrator? This is the verbal quality of the narration. And what is the focus of the narrator? Which is the visual angle. Okay? And I'll come back to those points underneath, but what I want to get at is there's sort of a math equation here that the voice of the narrator plus the focus of the narrator equals the point of view. Okay? So coming back to focus, right? When we think about photography, I don't know if there's any photographers in this class, but if you are, think about, that when you're a photographer, you have the ability to put certain things in focus and certain things out of focus. you want to highlight the things that you want to highlight, right? So the things that you think are important will be in focus. And so that is, in a sort of analogous way, what your author might be doing, right? And so the question to ask yourself as you're reading is, what is the narrator telling me and what are they not telling me? So what is in focus and what is not in focus? Sometimes you may have a narrator who is misleading you on purpose, which is kind of a fun scenario. I don't know if you've ever read anything like that, or maybe watched a film where the narrator was not who you thought that they were. And so the focus of the narrator will tell you a lot. The voice of the narrator will also tell you a lot. Is that narrator speaking in a certain style or a tone? Are they using certain diction or word choices that tell you something about them? Are they a character? Are they taking part in the story? Are they inside the story or outside the story? So there's a lot of questions you can ask yourself as you are reading. Think, who is telling me this story and what can I gather about that narrator? And can I trust their account? Okay, so let's look at a few different types of narration. The first, and probably maybe most common, maybe not most common, is the third person narration. Okay, the third person narration, this is an external narrator. It is not a character in the story. Okay, so the pronouns that you'll see used will be he went to the store, she jumped over the fence, they went to dinner. There's never an I or a me. This is not a personal account, but this is being told by someone else who is outside of the story. There's a few different types of third person narration. First, we have the omniscient or unlimited narration. And this is someone who, they're not inside the story, but they still have access to the thoughts and the feelings of the characters. So when we think about attributes of God, he is omniscient, right? So this might be a way to kind of help you remember this. And so he is unlimited. He has access to the feelings and thoughts of all of the people on earth, right? So our narrator, just in the same way, has access to the thoughts and feelings of all of the characters. This one is a little bit more rare to see, but you do see it. And then you've got your limited third person narration. This is someone who cannot access the thoughts and feelings of their characters. So the narration is really limited to the perspective of the narrator, the author. Okay. Last, objective. So this is something, a style that does not report any thoughts or feelings whatsoever. So it's usually very, very heavy dialogue, and we don't get any kind of thoughts or feelings of any characters. Okay. So a limited perspective might have access to one character's thoughts or feelings, but we can't see the others. But the objective has no access to any thoughts or feelings, even of the main character. We only get dialogue. And a great example of this is Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway, if you ever read any of his work or some of his short stories, a few years ago, this curriculum included a short story by Hemingway. It's not included anymore, which is a shame because I liked that one. But that had very, very heavy dialogue, and you really had to learn how to look between the lines, read between the lines, because you weren't given the thoughts or feelings of any of the characters. So this does occur. It's maybe a little more rare, but that is one of the styles of third-person narration. Let's move on to first-person narration. This is a singular first person, usually a major or minor character in the story. We are using words like I or me. So, I woke up one morning and the sun was shining through the window. Okay, might be the first opening line of a first person narration. And so this is oftentimes someone telling a story about his or her own experience. Again, I mentioned the unreliable narrator. This is not in every story, but it does happen. It's kind of fun where this narrator is feeding false information to you as the reader. It could be that you're reading a murder mystery and you think that they've got an alibi, and we read all this information, we come to the end, and oh my goodness, the narrator was the murderer all along. And so they were feeding us lies. So it's kind of a fun twist on like a murder mystery novel, if you've ever read anything like that. It could be a villain. They could be mentally insane. We can't dismiss everything that they say, but we have to sift through that information carefully. We kind of learn to be a little more critical as we sift through that information. There could be a plural first person narrator. So we might see more extensive uses of the pronoun we, and maybe occasional use of I or you, but for example, we were all very silent at first. This is Gaskell's novel, Cranford. There's more of a community focus rather than individual. I think you tend to see this really more in like Victorian, sort of 18th century or 19th century work. We might see more of this, but this is the first person plural. Okay. Lastly, let's look at second person narration. This is a text that might use extensively the word you. You, we might see it a little bit more of like as a how-to. You should open the page. You open to page 24. You should, or et cetera, et cetera. You might, those kinds of terms. And the technique kind of really brings you into the story as a character because it's talking directly to you. It's saying you, and you're receiving that as me. They're talking about me, or talking to me. So this is not very rare. This is very rare, not very common, I should say. And you might see it more like a how-to or kind of instructional type setting. So that is second person narration. And so let's look now. I just want to that kind of cues you up for the readings for this week. And you can kind of be thinking about who your narrators are in what you're reading and how that fits. And so let's look at week 2 assignments and reading. Up top, we've got the read, what we are going to be reading. This is in the learn section of week 2. You're going to be reading Sonny's Blues, which is a short story about two brothers in Harlem. We've got A Pair of Tickets, which is a story based on an Asian American woman who is going back to China. I won't give the plot away, but she is kind of revisiting her past and ancestry. And then we've got Interpreter of Maladies, and that's taking place in India. So we're kind of going international this week. Now, I will just warn you that the Interpreter of Maladies is a short story, but there's also there's a book of short stories called Interpreter of Maladies. And Interpreter of Maladies, the short story, is one of the short stories in the whole book. So I just want to let you know you don't have to read the whole book. Just the actual short story that's by that name is what you'll be reading. And then there's a few other linked videos and resources that you'll watch as well. In terms of assignments, this is under the apply section of week 2. Again, you'll be doing your in-class discussion summary. You can feel free to pause or rewind this video to look at some questions there. And then you'll do your reading quiz over week 2. You're going to submit a rough draft of the literary analysis. Oops, I put that there twice. My bad. Let's see, can I delete that? It's going to bother me. There we go. A rough draft of literary analysis. And so this should be kind of your fleshing out, if you will, of the outline that you did in week 1. So I will be reviewing those and giving you feedback as quickly as I can. And then you will use that feedback to create your rough draft and kind of making that a paper. Should be 3 to 4 pages. So let's look at a couple of things I just want to highlight before we finish here. So what does a successful literary analysis contain? I'm going to give you some do's and don'ts. The most important thing is that your literary analysis should have a strong argument. Okay? It should be an argument. It should not be a recap of the plot. It should not be just a nice little discussion of race in America. It should not be broad. It should not be vague. There should be a strong, specific argument that you state clearly in your thesis, and you should reinforce it as you go throughout your paper with each point that you make. It should reinforce your thesis statement, and then you need to restate it again clearly in the conclusion. Okay? It should also contain frequent use of the text for support. This is extremely important. You cannot have a literary analysis that does not quote from the literary text. So I should see direct and direct quotation, probably direct more so than indirect, but you can use indirect as well. An average amount of quotes would be about 2 to 3 per page. And I don't want to see like a whole page of a whole quote. That's far too long for a short paper of this length. In general, I would have you steer away from block quotes, the really, really long ones. You can always use an ellipsis, which is the 3 little periods, the 3 dots, to take out any unnecessary information in a quote and really just kind of get down to the nitty gritty. You should know how to do that from Comp 1 and 2. But make sure that you're using those quotes to support your points, to support your argument. Then you should offer commentary. So after you quote from the text, you should have some commentary where you discuss the quotation and how it supports your overall thesis. And I will show you the rubric momentarily. And then organization is also key. So your paper should have a clear organizational structure, and your outline will help with that. If I spot any potential issues with your outline, I will try to address that in your feedback. What does a literary analysis not contain? It does not contain first-person point of view. So I should not see any I's or me's or we's. This should be an academic third-person point of view paper. You should also not focus on anything other than the text. That includes scripture, even though we love God's word so much. And I'm not discouraging you from making any biblical connections. But what I am saying is that I do not want to see that you wrote a paper about the Bible and then just kind of put in a couple details about our text. That's kind of cheating because you might be tempted to kind of lean on something you know better. But what I'm asking you to do is write a paper about the text, our text. If you see some biblical analogies and you want to write a paper about some biblical principle that you see in this text, I'm okay with that. You just need to know that your primary focus should be on the text itself, and you can make some biblical connections. So it's really just more about what you're focusing on, okay? Now, I don't want to see personal stories. Again, we're not using first-person point of view, so I don't want to hear anything about your personal stories, even though I know that makes me sound like a horrible, mean person. I do want to know about your stories. I want to know about you, but not in this paper. So if you want to tell me your story, please email it to me or use it in a different class, but not in a literary analysis. I'd like to make sure that we teach you how to do this properly. And this also includes, a pastor one time said blah, 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 blah. So let's avoid that. We really want to stick to what the text is trying to say and not what a pastor said about something or, a celebrity or something like that. Do not write about other texts besides A Raisin in the Sun and possibly one other text from our readings. So keep to our readings from week 1. And don't try to bite off more than you can chew. So don't try to tackle more than 2 of our texts. So that's very key. I don't want to see a discussion, or I should say only a discussion, of a theme or a symbol or an idea. It's great to start with a discussion, but you need to have a conclusion. You need to have that strong argument. You need to be able to tell me why it's important. How do we see the play in a new way because of what you're talking about? So oftentimes I see people submitting papers to me that are discussing race in America, and it's a paper about the racial things that they see in A Raisin in the Sun. Now, that's great, but you're not giving me any kind of a real argument or conclusion. What do you think about race in America? What is it contributing? Like, what does the text say that it's contributed to? What does the text think about this? And so you want to come up with an angle on something that you see in the text. So if you see a theme of racism, then consider, is it condemned in the text? Is it excused in the text? What do the characters provide in to further that? And so you want to have a stance on something, not just a discussion. And so this then leads into my last point, which is you don't also want to just summarize the plot. Now, some summary may be required, maybe a short page or 3/4 of a page. You might want to recap something that might be important for your reader to know. But a whole paper that only summarizes the plot completely misses the point of a literary analysis. This is not a book report. This is an analysis. So I want to see you analyze the text, which means come up with your own ideas and support them. Okay, so let's look briefly at the rubric. Okay, so let's zoom in here on the superior column. These are the 5 areas that you will be graded on: your thesis, your use of text, your commentary, your MLA, grammar, mechanics, and usage. This says MLA, but it should be whatever the format of your major is, so APA or Turabian. And the structure of your paper says the organizational structure, as well as the flow. How does your writing flow? Is it choppy? Is it smooth? Are there transitional statements and thoughts between paragraphs? All those kinds of things. So I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit. Can I do that? So your thesis should be a single, strongly worded sentence that presents a sophisticated assertion and well predicts the essay's content. So you should have a great thesis that is reinforced as the paper goes on. You should not have a thesis that we never hear about again after the thesis statement. You need to try to keep that to 1 sentence. It might be 2 sentences, but really try to hone in and kind of condense that very strongly. And that should be the last sentence or 2 of your introductory paragraph. Use of text. I want to see you pulling support from the entire text. Don't just give me quotes from Act 1 because that will suggest to me that you did not read the whole text. So pull significant support, I should say, from the text, from all throughout the text. Support is used in a creative and insightful manner. And then commentary, your quotes should be insightfully discussed. They should be used to support your ideas, and you should be consistently engaging in analysis rather than summary. The citations are done perfectly. The formatting, grammar, mechanics, usage are nearly flawless. Errors of those inadvertence or of, I don't think that makes sense. Anyway, but yes, there should be very few errors is what that means. Okay, then the paper should follow a logical structure. It should have ample transitional material and have an excellent sense of introduction, body, and conclusion. The sentence style should be fluid and should demonstrate the creation of good emphasis. Word choice is specific, total effect is excellent. So an A paper is going to contain those things. All right, thesis example. I won't spend much time here because I will be posting about the importance of a great thesis. This is an example of a not great thesis. Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn is a great American novel. Okay, this person might be thinking that they are saying something argumentative, but in fact they are not. This is not specific, and it is very hard to quantify what great means. How do I support this idea that the novel is great? I can't. That's a very subjective statement, and it's something very hard to quantify. So let's look at a better example. This is thesis example number 2. Through its contrasting river and shore scenes, Twain's Huckleberry Finn suggests that to find the true expression of American democratic ideals, one must leave civilized society and go back to nature. Okay, this is an excellent thesis statement. And this kind of very clearly sets up the organizational structure of my paper as well, because I will kind of have the idea that we're going to start off contrasting river and shore scenes and showing how these scenes demonstrate this true expression of American democratic ideals, which I'm assuming will be defined at some point in the paper. What does this mean? and then showing that someone must leave civilized society and go back to nature. And again, this is proposing this overall idea that nature is better than civilized society. That's what's at stake here. That's sort of the ultimate message that's being presented. And so that should be explored in this paper. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of what to expect for your literary analysis. That's all I have for us today. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to email me with any questions, and I will see you all next Thursday